a surprising turn of events, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait have collectively declared their airspace and military bases off-limits for attacks against Iran. This unprecedented move marks a significant shift in the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, potentially altering the balance of power in the region. The unified stance represents a departure from historical alignments, where these nations often found themselves in competition or conflict with one another. This collective declaration underscores the Gulf states' adoption of neutrality as a survival mechanism, rooted in their historical experiences with foreign interventions and the devastating consequences of past conflicts. By positioning themselves as neutral parties, these nations aim to mitigate the risks associated with regional tensions and potential military escalations. The economic implications of this decision are substantial, highlighting the complex interplay between geopolitics and oil markets. As major oil producers, the Gulf states' stability is intrinsically linked to global energy security. This strategic shift may influence oil prices, trade relationships, and international investments in the region, factors that will be explored in greater detail later in this analysis. The geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East has witnessed an unexpected move. The Gulf states' unity reveals a deeper strategic calculus, rooted in historical experiences and regional dynamics. This collective stance of neutrality represents a significant shift in the balance of power, prompting us to explore the compelling factors that have driven these historically competitive nations to adopt such a unified position. The Gulf states' determination to prevent their territories from becoming battlegrounds for foreign conflicts stems from the devastating consequences of past wars. The Gulf Wars, particularly the 1990 invasion of Kuwait, left an indelible mark on the region's collective memory. These experiences have shaped the current leadership's approach to regional security, prioritizing stability and neutrality over direct involvement in potential conflicts. The presence of U.S. military bases in the region, such as Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, adds another layer of complexity to the Gulf states' strategic considerations. These bases have long been a source of tension with Iran, which perceives foreign military presence near its borders as a significant threat. In response, Gulf leaders have taken steps to reassure Iran about the non-offensive use of these facilities, carefully balancing their security relationships with Western powers against the need for regional stability. This delicate balancing act is evident in the Gulf states' recent communications with Iran. By explicitly stating that their territories will not be used for attacks against Iran, these nations are attempting to mitigate tensions and reduce the likelihood of retaliatory actions. This approach reflects a nuanced understanding of regional dynamics and the potential consequences of escalation. The Gulf states' unified stance also serves as a preemptive measure against the potential expansion of the Iran-Israel conflict into a broader global crisis. There is a growing recognition among Gulf leaders that such a conflict could draw in major powers like the United States, Russia, and China, transforming the region into a battleground for a much larger geopolitical struggle. By adopting a position of neutrality, these nations aim to insulate themselves from the fallout of such a scenario. However, the Gulf states are acutely aware that their neutrality does not guarantee safety. Iran has indicated that it could target the oil infrastructure of nations perceived as supporting Israel or the West, regardless of their declared neutrality. This threat underscores the precarious position of the Gulf states and the high stakes involved in their strategic decision-making. The unified stance of the Gulf states represents a significant evolution in their approach to regional security. By prioritizing collective stability over individual alliances, these nations are attempting to create a buffer against the volatile forces at play in the Middle East. This strategy reflects a sophisticated understanding of the region's complex power dynamics and the potential consequences of direct involvement in conflicts. Furthermore, this united front may signal a shift in the Gulf states' relationships with traditional Western allies, particularly the United States. While maintaining important security partnerships, these nations are increasingly asserting their own strategic interests and pursuing more independent foreign policies. This development could have far-reaching implications for the future of international relations in the region. The Gulf states' unified stance on neutrality rests upon a foundation as volatile as the region itself. While asserting strategic autonomy, these nations face an economic Achilles heel that shapes their geopolitical decisions and poses long-term risks in an evolving global energy landscape. At the heart of this vulnerability lies the Gulf states' critical dependence on oil exports, a resource that has long defined their economic stability and national identities. The Gulf states' unified stance on neutrality rests upon a foundation as volatile as the region itself. While asserting strategic autonomy, These nations face an economic Achilles heel that shapes their geopolitical decisions and poses long-term risks in an evolving global energy landscape. At the heart of this vulnerability lies the Gulf states' critical dependence on oil exports, a resource that has long defined their economic stability and national identities. The Gulf states' unified stance on neutrality rests upon a foundation as volatile as the region itself. While asserting strategic autonomy, these nations face an economic Achilles heel that shapes their geopolitical decisions and poses long-term risks in an evolving global energy landscape. At the heart of this vulnerability lies the Gulf states' critical dependence on oil exports, a resource that has long defined their economic stability and national identities. The economic imperatives driving the Gulf Cooperation Council (GCC) nations' recent diplomatic maneuvers cannot be overstated. Oil exports form the backbone of these economies, providing the majority of government revenues and fueling national development plans. This reliance on a single commodity, however, exposes these nations to significant risks, both from market fluctuations and regional instability. The 2019 attack on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of Gulf oil infrastructure. This single incident temporarily disrupted 5% of global oil supply, sending shockwaves through international markets and highlighting the potential consequences of regional conflicts on global energy security. The attack underscored the precarious position of Gulf states, whose economic well-being is inextricably linked to the uninterrupted flow of oil exports. In light of these vulnerabilities, the potential consequences of involvement in the Iran-Israel conflict become even more pronounced for the Gulf states. Any escalation that leads to retaliatory strikes on oil facilities could have catastrophic effects, not only on the local economies but also on global energy markets. The prospect of a widespread disruption to oil production in the Gulf region raises the specter of a global energy crisis, with far-reaching economic and geopolitical ramifications. Gulf leaders are acutely aware that any significant disruption to oil production could spell disaster for their economies. This awareness has become a driving force behind their push for neutrality in regional conflicts. By distancing themselves from potential flashpoints, these nations aim to safeguard their economic interests and maintain the stability necessary for continued oil exports. However, the Gulf states face long-term challenges that extend beyond immediate geopolitical concerns. The global shift towards renewable energy sources poses an existential threat to economies heavily reliant on fossil fuel exports. As the world increasingly embraces clean energy alternatives, the demand for oil is projected to decline in the coming decades, potentially leaving Gulf economies vulnerable to significant revenue shortfalls. Recognizing this looming challenge, several Gulf states have initiated ambitious economic diversification plans. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 program stands as a prime example of these efforts, aiming to reduce the kingdom's dependence on oil revenues by developing new industries and attracting foreign investment. However, these transitions are complex and time-consuming, and the Gulf states continue to rely heavily on oil exports in the interim. The prospect of oil fields becoming battlegrounds in the Iran-Israel conflict represents a nightmare scenario for Gulf leaders. Such a development would not only jeopardize their primary source of income, but could also derail ongoing efforts to diversify their economies. The potential for widespread destruction of oil infrastructure could set back economic development plans by years, if not decades. Moreover, the interconnected nature of global energy markets means that any major disruption in Gulf oil production would have ripple effects worldwide. Energy importing nations would face supply shortages and price spikes, potentially triggering economic downturns and geopolitical instability far beyond the Middle East. The Gulf states' declaration of neutrality presents a paradox in the complex web of Middle Eastern politics. As these oil-rich nations attempt to distance themselves from regional conflicts, they simultaneously risk becoming central players in a high-stakes game of economic and diplomatic maneuvering. This delicate balancing act raises critical questions about the effectiveness of neutrality as a strategy in a region where geopolitical tensions and economic interests are deeply intertwined. The Gulf states' declaration of neutrality presents a paradox in the complex web of Middle Eastern politics. As these oil-rich nations attempt to distance themselves from regional conflicts, they simultaneously risk becoming central players in a high-stakes game of economic and diplomatic maneuvering. This delicate balancing act raises critical questions about the effectiveness of neutrality as a strategy in a region where geopolitical tensions and economic interests are deeply intertwined. The Gulf states' positioning as potential mediators in regional disputes represents a significant shift in their traditional roles. By adopting a neutral stance, these nations aim to de-escalate tensions and prevent the spread of conflicts that could destabilize the entire region. This approach reflects a growing recognition of the interconnected nature of regional security and economic stability. However, the effectiveness of this strategy remains uncertain, particularly in the face of long-standing rivalries and complex power dynamics. One of the primary challenges facing the Gulf states in their pursuit of neutrality is the persistent threat to their oil facilities. Despite their efforts to remain impartial, these nations face the ongoing risk of their critical infrastructure being targeted if perceived as supporting Israel or Western powers. This vulnerability underscores the limitations of neutrality in a region where perceptions and alliances can shift rapidly, potentially exposing the Gulf states to retaliation regardless of their stated positions. The economic consequences of failing to maintain neutrality could be severe, both for the Gulf states and the global economy. Any significant disruption to oil production in the region would likely trigger widespread market volatility, potentially leading to supply shortages and price spikes. Such a scenario could have far-reaching implications, affecting energy importing nations worldwide and potentially triggering economic downturns beyond the Middle East. For the Gulf states themselves, the stakes are particularly high. Their economies remain heavily dependent on oil exports, despite ongoing diversification efforts. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 plan, for example, aims to reduce this dependence by investing in sectors such as tourism and technology. However, this transition will take time, leaving these nations vulnerable in the short to medium term. Any major disruption to oil production could severely impact government revenues, potentially derailing economic development plans and social programs. The Gulf states must also contend with the changing global energy landscape. The growing emphasis on renewable energy sources poses a long-term challenge to oil-dependent economies. As the world gradually shifts away from fossil fuels, the Gulf states face the prospect of declining demand for their primary export. This transition adds urgency to their efforts to diversify their economies and reduce their reliance on oil revenues. In navigating these complex challenges, the Gulf states are attempting to strike a delicate balance between regional stability, economic interests, and international relations. Their unified stance on neutrality represents an effort to insulate themselves from potential conflicts while preserving their economic foundations. However, this approach also carries risks, potentially limiting their influence in regional affairs and exposing them to criticism from traditional allies. The effectiveness of the Gulf states' neutrality strategy will likely depend on their ability to maintain credibility with all parties involved in regional disputes. This requires careful diplomacy and a consistent approach to regional issues. The Gulf states must demonstrate their commitment to impartiality while simultaneously safeguarding their own interests and maintaining crucial international relationships. The Gulf states' unified stance on neutrality represents a significant shift in regional dynamics, potentially reshaping the balance of power in the Middle East. This alignment challenges traditional alliances and introduces a new paradigm for conflict resolution and regional stability. By positioning themselves as mediators rather than participants in regional disputes, these nations aim to de-escalate tensions and prevent the spread of conflicts beyond their borders. The Gulf states' unified stance on neutrality represents a significant shift in regional dynamics, potentially reshaping the balance of power in the Middle East. This alignment challenges traditional alliances and introduces a new paradigm for conflict resolution and regional stability. By positioning themselves as mediators rather than participants in regional disputes, these nations aim to de-escalate tensions and prevent the spread of conflicts beyond their borders. However, this approach is not without risks. The Gulf states must navigate complex relationships with both Iran and Western powers while safeguarding their economic interests. Their success in maintaining neutrality could have far-reaching implications for global geopolitics and energy markets. As major oil producers, any disruption to their production could trigger a significant energy crisis worldwide. The long-term impacts of this shift may include a recalibration of international relations in the region and a reassessment of global energy security strategies.